I found out my wife was cheating because my cousin called me at 6 in the morning and asked why I had sent him a voice note crying in my car. And the problem was that I had sent no such thing. I had not cried, and I had not even spoken to him in 3 weeks, which was the exact moment my normal life split open and everything ugly inside my marriage started spilling out. I am 34. My wife Melissa is 32. And until recently, I was the kind of idiot who would have described us as going through a rough patch but basically solid, because that is what a man tells himself when he is standing in the middle of a burning house trying to call the smoke bad weather. We had been married for 7 years, together for 10, and for most of that time I believed our biggest problems were normal adult problems: money being tight, her temper getting sharper every year, my long hours at work, and the way every conversation somehow turned into a courtroom where I was the defendant and she was the prosecutor who already hated me before opening statements. Even then, I kept making excuses for her because that is what love looked like to me: swallowing the disrespect and calling it patience, hearing lies and calling them misunderstandings, watching her roll her eyes at me in front of friends and family, and telling myself she was just stressed. The first signs were so small, I almost feel humiliated admitting I ignored them, because looking back, they were not signs. They were alarms. She started taking her phone everywhere, even to the shower, and if I walked into a room too quietly, she would flip it over so fast it looked rehearsed. She began inventing errands that made no sense: late coffee runs, sudden trips to help a friend, weird drives across town for things we did not need. And every explanation came with that same irritated look, like my confusion was a personal attack on her freedom. One night I asked, as calmly as I could, "Why do you keep acting like your phone is a state secret every time I come near you? And why do your stories keep changing every time I ask where you were?" And she gave me this cold laugh and said, "Maybe if you had a life of your own, you would not be so obsessed with mine," which landed harder than I want to admit, because it was cruel in that precise way. Only someone who knows your insecurities can be cruel. Then she kissed my cheek like she had not just cut me open, told me I was being dramatic, and went to bed with her back turned toward me like I was the one poisoning the marriage. But the voice note changed everything, because my cousin Derek sounded nervous when he called and said, "Man, I do not know what kind of breakdown you are having, but if you are sending me drunken messages at sunrise, I need to know whether you are all right." And when I asked him to play it, I heard Melissa's voice in the background for half a second before the message cut off, low and laughing, intimate in a way that made my stomach drop so hard I actually had to sit down. That was the moment something inside me went cold, because I knew 2 things at once. She had lied to me again, and whatever this was, it was no longer a suspicion. It was a door opening into something that was going to cost me more than sleep. I hung up with Derek, looked toward the bedroom where my wife was still sleeping, and for the first time in my marriage, I felt like a stranger in my own home. I did not wake her up right away, and that hesitation still bothers me because it meant some part of me already suspected the truth and was afraid of hearing it spoken out loud. So instead, I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand while the morning light crept through the blinds and turned our quiet house into a place that suddenly felt staged, like every piece of furniture had been arranged to hide something from me. I replayed the voice message Derek had forwarded 3 more times, and every time I heard that faint laugh behind his confused greeting, I felt the same tightening in my chest, because I knew that voice the way a husband knows the rhythm of his own breathing. It was Melissa, unmistakably Melissa, laughing in that low, playful way she used when she wanted something from someone. The same laugh she used when we were dating, and she knew I would eventually say yes to whatever she asked. Around 7, she finally walked into the kitchen wearing one of my old shirts and holding her phone like it was part of her hand. And for a moment, everything looked so normal that I almost convinced myself I had misunderstood what I heard. She poured coffee, leaned against the counter, and asked in that slightly impatient tone she had developed over the last year, "Why are you staring at the table like someone died? And why have you been awake long enough to make the entire house smell like coffee?" And I remember looking at her face and thinking about how strange it was that someone could live beside you for years while slowly becoming someone you no longer recognized. I slid my phone across the table and said quietly, "Derek called me this morning asking why I sent him a message crying in my car. And the strange part is that I never sent him anything. So maybe you can help me understand why my cousin thinks I was talking to him while your voice was laughing in the background." She froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the truth to show itself before the performance began. And then she rolled her eyes with a sharp breath and said, "You are seriously waking me up with conspiracy theories now, because if your cousin is confused about something, you should probably ask him instead of standing here accusing your wife like you are some detective in a cheap drama." Her reaction should have calmed me if she were telling the truth, but instead it felt rehearsed, like she had already practiced being offended before the question even existed. And the longer she talked, the more defensive her voice became. She crossed her arms and continued, "I swear sometimes you invent problems just so you can feel important, because normal people trust their spouses instead of digging around for imaginary betrayals that only exist in their heads." That was the moment something heavy settled in my chest, because her anger was not the anger of someone falsely accused. It was the anger of someone cornered, and while she kept talking, I suddenly realized I was no longer trying to prove anything. I was simply waiting for the next lie to arrive. I wish I could say I handled that moment with calm logic and patience, but the truth is that the more she talked, the more something restless started building inside my chest. Because Melissa had always been good at turning questions into accusations and accusations into my fault. And suddenly I could see the pattern so clearly that it felt like watching a play I had somehow memorized without realizing it. I leaned back in the chair and said slowly, "You know what is strange about this whole situation, Melissa? It is not even the message itself. It is the fact that Derek said he heard you laughing while he thought he was listening to me. And I keep trying to imagine the circumstances where my wife and my cousin would be in the same place early in the morning while he believes he is receiving emotional voice notes from me." She stared at me like I had just insulted her entire family line. And then she launched into one of those speeches she used whenever she wanted to bury a conversation under outrage. "You really need help," she said with this bitter half-smile that always appeared right before she started rewriting reality. "Because this jealousy thing you are developing is honestly embarrassing, and if you spent half as much time improving yourself as you do inventing ridiculous accusations, maybe our marriage would not feel like living with a suspicious detective who cannot mind his own business." The strange thing was that while she spoke, her phone lit up on the counter with a message notification, and I swear my heart stopped for a second because the name on the screen was Derek. She grabbed the phone almost instantly, but not before I saw it clearly enough to feel the ground shift beneath my feet. I remember standing up slowly and saying, with a calmness that did not feel natural even to me, "That is interesting timing, because I was just talking about Derek, and somehow he is sending you messages right now while we are having this conversation about why he thought I was sending him voice notes." Melissa's reaction was immediate and explosive in a way that felt less like anger and more like panic wrapped in anger. She stepped forward, clutching the phone against her chest, and said, "You are not looking at my messages like some controlling husband who thinks he owns my private conversations, and the fact that you even care who texts me says a lot more about your insecurity than it does about anything I am doing." But then something happened that I did not expect, and that still feels surreal when I remember it, because while we were standing there arguing in the kitchen, my phone rang again, and the name on the screen was Derek for the second time that morning. I answered it without breaking eye contact with Melissa, and the first thing he said was a sentence that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. He said, in a nervous voice that sounded nothing like his usual confident tone, "Listen, man, I think I messed up earlier because that voice message I told you about was not just strange, it was sent from Melissa's number, and I think you deserve to know that before things get worse." I watched the color drain from my wife's face as she realized exactly what he had just told me. And in that moment, the house felt smaller, quieter, and far more fragile than it had ever felt before. The silence after Derek said that felt heavier than any shouting match we had ever had, because there is something terrifying about hearing the truth arrive from someone who does not even realize they are exposing it. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear and looked at Melissa, and the expression on her face was not anger anymore but calculation, like someone desperately searching for a story strong enough to survive the evidence already on the table. I said quietly, "He just told me the message came from your number, which means one of two things is happening here, and neither of them makes you look honest." For a moment she said nothing, and then she let out this long, dramatic sigh, as if the entire situation were simply another inconvenience in her day. "You know what?" she said in a voice dripping with irritation. "This is exactly why I hate talking to you about anything serious, because you jump to these ridiculous conclusions before hearing the obvious explanation." She walked around the kitchen island slowly, speaking with exaggerated patience, as if she were explaining something simple to a child. "Derek called me last night asking about a surprise he wanted to plan for you, and we were trying to figure out how to get you out of the house next weekend without ruining it. And at some point we recorded a message as a joke, and apparently he sent it by accident this morning. Congratulations. You have now turned a harmless surprise into a full-blown interrogation." If someone had told me that explanation a year earlier, I probably would have believed it, because Melissa had always been talented at delivering lies with enough confidence that they almost sounded like logic. But something had changed in me that morning. Maybe because I had already heard the tone in Derek's voice when he called. Maybe because I had finally grown tired of playing the role of the man who apologizes for asking obvious questions. I leaned against the table and said slowly, "That is interesting, because when Derek called me, he sounded nervous, not playful, and the way he described the message made it sound less like a surprise plan and more like he accidentally received something he was not supposed to hear." Her face hardened immediately, and the kindness vanished from her performance. She crossed her arms and said with sharp contempt, "You know what your real problem is, Michael. You are so insecure that even kindness from other people feels suspicious to you. Derek was trying to do something nice for you, and instead of appreciating it, you are standing here inventing some disgusting fantasy about betrayal." She stepped closer, her voice rising with every word. "Honestly, if this is what marriage with you is going to feel like from now on, constantly defending myself against your paranoia, maybe you should start asking whether you are the one destroying this relationship." Then another unexpected moment crashed into the argument before either of us could say anything else. My phone buzzed again, and when I looked down, I saw a text message from Derek that simply read, "Man, I am really sorry, but I think Melissa is about to lie to you right now." I looked up at my wife slowly while the words were still glowing on the screen, and in that instant I realized something inside our marriage had already broken long before this morning. When I read Derek's message out loud, the atmosphere in the kitchen changed so fast, it almost felt like the room itself recoiled from the truth trying to enter it. I looked directly at Melissa and said slowly, "He just texted me saying you're about to lie to me, and I would really like to hear which part of this situation you think I am supposed to misunderstand now." Her reaction was explosive in a way that felt less like anger and more like a desperate attempt to regain control of a story that was slipping away from her. She slammed her hand on the counter and said with sharp venom, "This is exactly what I mean when I say you are paranoid, because now you are letting your cousin manipulate you into doubting your own wife, and frankly, I am disgusted that you would believe him over the person you promised to trust for the rest of your life." But while she was speaking, my phone buzzed again with another message from Derek, and this one was not a short warning but a long explanation that made my stomach feel like it was collapsing inward. He wrote that he had not known I was completely unaware of what had been happening between him and Melissa for the last few months, that he had been under the impression she had already told me about their situation, and that the voice message earlier that morning had been sent accidentally while they were talking in his car after dropping someone off. I remember staring at those words while the room around me seemed to lose its balance, because betrayal from one person is painful enough, but betrayal from two people who share your blood and your home creates a kind of confusion that feels almost unreal. I lifted my eyes toward Melissa and said in a voice that sounded strangely calm even to me, "He just told me something very different from the story you gave me, and it involves the two of you spending time together in ways that do not look anything like planning surprises. For a second, she did not speak at all, and the silence was louder than any argument we had ever had. Then her expression changed into something colder, something almost annoyed rather than ashamed. "You know what?" she said with an irritated shrug. "If Derek wants to start drama because he cannot keep his mouth shut, that is his problem, not mine. Maybe we have been talking more than you would like. Maybe we have been meeting to discuss family issues. Maybe we even spent time together that you would find uncomfortable. But none of that automatically means the disgusting thing you are clearly imagining." Her tone carried this strange mixture of arrogance and dismissal, as if the real crime in the room was not betrayal, but my willingness to notice it. I could feel anger rising inside me, heavy and sharp, but beneath it there was something even worse beginning to take shape. A realization that the person standing in front of me did not look like a partner trying to repair damage. She looked like someone irritated that the secret had become inconvenient, and that realization hurt more than anything Derek could have confessed. I remember standing there in the kitchen realizing that the conversation was no longer about whether something had happened between my wife and my cousin, because the truth had already started leaking through the cracks, and the real question now was how far the betrayal had gone, and how long I had been living inside a lie without realizing it. I looked at Melissa and said slowly, "I want you to understand something very clearly before this conversation continues, because at this point, the truth matters a lot more than your pride. And if there is even a small part of you that still respects this marriage, now would be the moment to stop performing and start explaining." For a moment, she just stared at me with that same irritated expression, like the entire situation was an inconvenience interrupting her morning. Then she laughed, and it was not the warm laugh I remembered from years ago, but a sharp, dismissive sound that felt like a door slamming shut. "You really want honesty right now," she said with cold sarcasm, "because if that is what you are asking for, maybe you should prepare yourself for the possibility that you are not the victim you keep pretending to be." She walked slowly around the kitchen as if she had suddenly decided to take control of the narrative instead of defending herself. "Derek and I started talking more because you were never around. Because every time I needed support, you were buried in work or staring at your laptop pretending our problems would solve themselves." I could feel anger tightening in my chest, but I forced myself to stay still while she continued speaking. "At first it was just conversations," she said with an exaggerated shrug, "because he actually listened when I talked about how lonely this marriage had become, and eventually those conversations turned into spending time together. And maybe that made you uncomfortable when you found out about it. But do not stand there acting shocked like you were some perfect husband who never pushed me away." The way she said it was not apologetic or even conflicted. It was defensive, almost proud, like she had already decided the story where she was justified was the only version that mattered. I finally said quietly, "So instead of telling your husband you were unhappy, you decided the solution was to secretly build a relationship with my cousin and lie about it every day." She rolled her eyes immediately and replied, "You are twisting things again, because you always need a villain in your little emotional drama, and it is exhausting watching you play the martyr." And then another unexpected twist landed in the middle of that argument. My phone buzzed again with a new message from Derek, and this time it was not a text, but a short video clip he had sent with the words, "You deserve to see what she told me about you." I stared at the screen for a moment before pressing play, not realizing that whatever I was about to hear would hurt more than the betrayal itself. I did not expect a 30-second video to feel heavier than the entire conversation that came before it. But the moment I pressed play, I realized Derek had not sent it to hurt me. He had sent it because he finally understood how deep the lie had been running. The clip showed Melissa sitting in his car late at night, the streetlights reflecting across the windshield, and her voice carried that same low, amused tone I had heard earlier in the morning. She was telling him things about me that sounded less like complaints and more like a character assassination performed for someone she wanted to impress. She said, slowly and casually, "Michael likes to pretend he is the reasonable one in our marriage. But honestly, he is exhausting to live with. And half the time I feel like I am babysitting someone who thinks responsibility means working late and ignoring the person waiting at home. Hearing your own wife describe you like that to another man is a strange kind of pain, because it is not loud or explosive at first. It is quiet, heavy, and humiliating. Like standing in a room where everyone else already knows something terrible about you except you. I finished the clip and slowly lowered the phone, while Melissa watched my face with a mixture of annoyance and impatience. She clearly knew what Derek had sent, because her first reaction was not fear or regret, but irritation. "Oh, great," she said with a bitter laugh. "So now he is sending you edited little videos to make himself look innocent and make me look like the villain, because apparently that is easier than admitting he misunderstood things and created this entire mess." I looked at her for a long moment before answering, because something inside me had finally settled into a calm I had never felt before. It was not peace. It was clarity. I said quietly, "That video was not edited, and even if it was, the words still came from you." She threw her hands in the air dramatically and said, "Yes, I complained about you to someone who actually listens. Congratulations. You have discovered that people sometimes vent about their spouses." But the thing that changed everything was not the video itself. It was the way she looked at me while defending it. There was no guilt in her eyes. There was no sadness about what our marriage had become. There was only frustration that the situation had become inconvenient. And that was the moment I realized I had already lost something much bigger than my wife's loyalty. I had lost the version of our life that I thought was real. I stood there for a long time after that video ended, longer than any argument had ever lasted in our house, and the strangest thing about that moment was the quiet. For years our conflicts had always been loud, filled with accusations, interruptions, and dramatic speeches about who was right and who was wrong. But now the silence felt heavier than shouting ever had. Melissa watched me with that same impatient expression, like she was waiting for me to either explode or apologize for making her morning inconvenient. Instead, I said something very simple that I had never said before in our marriage. I told her, slowly and clearly, "I think I finally understand something about us that I refused to see for a long time, and it is not just that you lied to me. It is that you stopped respecting me long before the lies started." She immediately rolled her eyes and let out a tired laugh, the kind people use when they think someone else is being dramatic. "Oh, please," she said. "Do not turn this into one of your emotional speeches where you act like the tragic hero of a relationship that was obviously broken from both sides." Then she crossed her arms and added with sharp annoyance, "If you are going to stand there pretending you were some perfect husband who never ignored me, never pushed me away, never made this marriage miserable, then you are rewriting history just as much as you claim I am." But something had changed in me by then, and it surprised even me how calm I felt while she spoke. I realized that the anger I expected to feel had already burned itself out during the last few hours, leaving behind something quieter but far more certain. I looked at her and said, "I never claimed to be perfect, but there is a difference between failing at a marriage and secretly replacing it while pretending everything is fine." She started to respond again, her voice rising into another defensive speech, but I interrupted her for the first time in years. "You do not have to keep explaining things to me anymore," I said, "because the decision I need to make is no longer about proving what happened. It is about deciding whether I want to spend the rest of my life living with someone who treats honesty like an inconvenience." That was the moment the conversation finally stopped feeling like a fight and started feeling like an ending. I walked past her, grabbed my jacket, and stepped outside into the cold morning air, realizing that the marriage I had been trying to protect was already gone long before today. If anyone reading this is in a situation where the signs are there but the truth feels too painful to face, I can only say this from experience. Ignoring betrayal does not protect your relationship. It only delays the moment when reality arrives and asks what kind of life you are willing to accept. I spent years convincing myself that patience would fix everything, But the real lesson I learned is that respect cannot survive where honesty has already disappeared.